Picture a hillside in France. The year is 1865. A doctor named Paul Broca is looking at an old skull. It's thousands of years old, and there's a hole in it. Not a crack, not damage from a fall or a fight. A hole with smooth, rounded edges. Someone had cut it on purpose, and the bone around that hole had healed. That last part is what stopped Broca cold. Healed bone means one thing: the person lived. They survived having a hole cut into their skull. Not for days, not for weeks. Some of these people lived for years afterward. This wasn't some rare, one-off discovery either. Since then, archaeologists have found thousands of skulls like this all over the world. France, Peru, Russia, China, different continents, different cultures, different time periods, all doing the same strange thing, cutting into human skulls and often keeping the patient alive. Here's what makes this so hard to wrap your head around. We're not talking about ancient Rome. We're not even talking about ancient Egypt. Some of these skulls date back 7,000 years. That's before writing, before the wheel, before anyone had figured out metal tools. These are Stone Age people, farmers, hunters, people who didn't have a word for bacteria or infection. And they were opening human heads and getting people to walk away afterward. The medical term for this is trepanation. It just means cutting a hole in the skull. Doctors still do a version of it today, actually. It's called a craniotomy. Surgeons use it to relieve pressure on the brain, remove tumours, treat serious injuries. So the idea itself isn't crazy. Brain surgery works. It saved millions of lives. But modern surgeons have anesthesia, sterile tools, imaging scans that show exactly where to cut, antibiotics waiting on standby in case something goes wrong. Stone Age surgeons had none of that. They had stone blades, maybe some sharpened flint or obsidian, no way to see inside the skull before cutting, no understanding of germs, no painkillers beyond whatever plants they might have chewed or brewed. And yet the survival rates on some of these skulls are stunning. In certain sites, more than half the patients lived. In a few places, the number climbs even higher than that. Think about that for a second. Modern surgery, with all our tools and training, still carries real risk. Now imagine cutting into someone's head with a rock, and somehow getting it right often enough that entire cultures kept doing it, generation after generation, for thousands of years. That's not an accident. You don't get lucky that many times. Luck runs out. Something else was going on. These early surgeons knew things, real things, things we're still trying to piece together today. This is honestly one of my favourite mysteries in all of ancient history, because it breaks the story we usually tell ourselves about early humans. We like to picture them as simple, struggling just to survive, not exactly performing surgery. But the skulls don't lie. Someone, somewhere, figured out how to open a human head without killing the person inside it. And then they taught someone else how to do it, and that person taught someone else. Across oceans, across thousands of years, without ever comparing notes. So here's the real question, and it's the one we're going to sit with tonight. How did people with no metal, no writing, no science as we'd recognise it, manage to perform brain surgery and keep patients alive doing it? And maybe the stranger question is why? Why would you risk cutting into someone's skull in the first place? What could possibly be worth that risk in a world where a simple cut could turn deadly within days? The answers take us into pain, belief, medicine, and the very edge of what the human body can survive. Some of it will surprise you. Some of it might unsettle you a little in a quiet, thoughtful way. But all of it is real, written in bone, waiting 7,000 years to be understood. Let's get into it. So how do we actually know these people survived? It's a fair question. Bones don't come with medical charts. Nobody left behind a note saying patient recovered fully. So let's talk about how scientists read this story straight from the bone itself. Here's the trick. Bone is alive. While you're breathing, your skeleton is constantly rebuilding itself. Old bone breaks down, new bone grows in to replace it. This happens your whole life, slowly, quietly, without you noticing. That matters a lot here, because it means bone has a memory. When you cut into a skull, the edges of that cut look one way at first, sharp, rough, raw. But if the person is still alive, the body gets to work almost right away. It starts smoothing those edges, filling in gaps, laying down new material around the wound. That process leaves a signature, a very specific, very readable signature, and it's how scientists can look at a hole in a skull thousands of years later and tell you with real confidence whether that person lived or died on the table. Let's get into what that signature actually looks like. Right after the cut, the edge of the bone is jagged, sharp under a microscope, no smoothness anywhere. If someone died during the operation, or shortly after, the bone stays like that, raw, unhealed, frozen in that first rough state forever, because a dead body doesn't repair itself. But if the patient survived even a few weeks, the bone starts to change. The sharp edges begin to round off. You start seeing what scientists call new bone growth. A thin layer, almost like a scar, forming along the cut. It's rough at first, bumpy, not fully smooth, but it's clearly healing. Give that patient a few months and the transformation gets dramatic. The edges round out completely. The new bone thickens. Sometimes it nearly closes the gap. In the most extreme cases, the hole shrinks so much you can barely tell surgery happened there at all. And then there's the strongest evidence of all. Multiple healed holes in the same skull. This shows up more than you'd expect. One skull, cut open, healed. Then cut open again somewhere else on the head, and healed again. Sometimes even a third time. Think about what that means. This wasn't some desperate one-time do-or-die operation. People were surviving trepanation, recovering, going back to their normal lives, and then getting cut open again later. Maybe years later. That's not luck. That's a medical practice people trusted enough to repeat. Scientists have found skulls with as many as 5 or 7 separate healed openings. Different sites, different edges, different stages of healing, all on one head, all from one person who kept surviving it. Now here's where the numbers get genuinely wild. At a burial site in France called Ensisheim, researchers studied dozens of trepanned skulls from thousands of years ago. Most of them showed clear signs of healing, not partial healing, full rounded remodeled bone, meaning the patients didn't just survive the surgery, they lived on for years afterward. In Peru, the numbers get even more incredible. Archaeologists have pulled thousands of trepanned skulls from ancient burial grounds there, spanning different centuries and different cultures. Early sites show survival rates around 40%. Not amazing, but not nothing either. But later sites, closer to 1,000 years ago, show survival rates jumping to 80 or even 90%. Let that sink in for a second. 90% survival for skull surgery, done with stone or metal blades, no anesthesia we know of beyond herbs, no germ theory, no antibiotics. Compare that to European battlefield surgery from the 1800s, just 200 years ago. Survival rates for skull operations back then were often below 50%, sometimes far below. Doctors in wool coats, using metal tools they didn't always clean between patients, working in rooms that weren't sterile at all. So somehow, ancient surgeons using stone blades were matching, and in some cases beating, survival rates from doctors operating thousands of years later. With microscopes, with actual medical training, with books full of anatomy diagrams. That's the puzzle sitting right in front of us, and it's the kind of thing that should stop you in your tracks a little. How are they doing this? Here's one clue that keeps showing up: the shape of the cuts. In many ancient skulls, the openings aren't random gashes. They're careful, controlled, made with small repeated scraping motions instead of one violent chop. Scientists can actually see the tiny grooves left behind from repeated scraping with a sharp stone tool. That detail matters more than it sounds like. A slow, careful scraping method causes far less trauma to the brain and its surrounding tissue than a fast, forceful strike would. Less shock to the body, less bleeding, less risk of driving bone fragments down into the brain itself. In other words, this wasn't random hacking. It was technique. Real, practiced, repeatable technique. There's also the placement of the cuts. Ancient surgeons, across totally different cultures with zero contact with each other, tended to avoid certain danger zones on the skull. Areas thick with blood vessels. Regions sitting right over major parts of the brain. Instead, they favoured spots that were, frankly, safer choices anatomically. Nobody wrote this down as a rule. There were no textbooks, no shared network passing notes between France and Peru. And yet the pattern shows up again and again on different continents, thousands of years apart. Which means people learn this through observation, trial and error, carried out across countless surgeries over countless generations. Someone tried a cut in one place and the patient died. Someone tried it somewhere else and the patient lived. That knowledge got passed down, refined, improved, slowly, patiently, one skull at a time. Some researchers believe there might have even been something like specialist healers. People in the group who did this work more than anyone else. People who got good at it the way a blacksmith gets good at metal, or a potter gets good at clay. Practice, repetition, mastery earned the hard way. And there's another detail worth sitting with. The size of most of these holes. They're often surprisingly small, just a couple of inches across. Not the massive openings you might imagine. That precision suggests real control, real restraint, not panic, not guesswork. Someone who knew exactly how much bone needed to come out and stopped there. Put all of this together and a picture starts to form. Not of desperate, clumsy people hacking away at heads and hoping for the best, but of skilled hands, careful eyes, knowledge built slowly, tested constantly, and passed down with real care. This is honestly my favourite part of the whole mystery, because it means these ancient surgeons weren't guessing. They were practicing medicine, real medicine, built without writing, without science as we know it, without a single microscope. Just patience, observation, and an incredible willingness to learn from every single attempt. So the bones tell us the what. They tell us people survived, sometimes for years, sometimes more than once. They tell us the cuts were careful, the placement was smart, and the results in many cases rivaled or beat surgery from centuries much closer to our own time. But the bones can only tell us so much. They can't tell us what these surgeons were thinking. They can't tell us what tools sat in their hands exactly. They can't explain how someone with no concept of germs still managed to avoid the infections that should have killed almost everyone. That's the real riddle waiting for us next. How did people working with stone, with no writing, with none of our science, reach survival numbers that would have embarrassed trained doctors thousands of years later? People with medical degrees, people with proper tools, people who still couldn't match what Stone Age hands were doing with a sharpened rock. Let's pause here for a second. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. That's the whole point. So if your eyes are getting heavy right now, good. That means it's working. Maybe hit subscribe and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I check the comments a lot, and honestly, it's one of my favourite parts of this whole thing. Someone in Tokyo just waking up, someone in London on their lunch break, someone in California wide awake at midnight like always. All of you, scattered across the planet, ending up in the exact same place, thinking about skulls from thousands of years ago, about ancient hands holding stone blades, about people who trusted each other enough to let someone cut into their head and hope for the best. It's a strange thing to share, but here we are. Okay, let's get back into it. We know they survived. That much is settled. Now let's talk about the harder question. How did they actually do it? Picture the tool for a second. Not a scalpel, not steel. A piece of flint or maybe obsidian chipped down to an edge so thin it's almost see-through. Obsidian is volcanic glass, and when you break it right, the edge you get is sharper than a modern razor blade. Surgeons today have actually tested this. Some have used obsidian blades in real operations just to see how they perform. The cuts are cleaner than steel, less tissue damage, faster healing. So the raw material wasn't the problem. The problem was skill. And skill, it turns out, they had plenty of. Let's talk about the actual method, because this is where it gets interesting. There were a few different techniques found at dig sites around the world, and they didn't all do it the same way. The first method is called scraping. You take a sharp stone tool and you slowly, patiently scrape away at the skull, layer by layer. It's slow, it's careful, and it leaves a very specific mark behind. Under a microscope, scraped bone shows short parallel lines, all going the same direction like tiny brush strokes. That pattern doesn't happen by accident. It happens when someone works in a controlled, repeated motion, someone who's done this before. The second method is grooving. Instead of scraping a wide area, you cut a deep line, again and again, in the same spot. Over time, that groove gets deeper. Eventually, you can lift out a piece of bone in one clean move. This one takes real precision. Cut too shallow, and you're there all day. Cut too deep, and you go straight through the skull into the brain. There's no room for guessing. You need to know exactly how thick that bone is at that exact spot on that exact person's head. And the third method, this is the one that really gets me, is drilling. Small holes drilled close together in a circle. Then you connect the holes and pop out the circle of bone in the middle. It's basically the same idea as those little metal saw surgeons use today, just built out of stone thousands of years before metal even existed as an idea. Now here's the part that should stop you cold. All three of these methods needed something they technically shouldn't have had: anatomical knowledge. Think about what that means. To cut into a skull and not kill the person, you need to know where the skull is thick and where it's thin. You need to know which spots are safer to cut and which ones will kill someone instantly. You need to understand that the brain moves and pulses gently under the bone. Cut in the wrong place, at the wrong depth, and the patient bleeds out in minutes. There's no coming back from that. So the fact that most of these patients survived tells us something huge. Whoever did this had done it before, more than once, probably many times. There's another detail that backs this up, and it's honestly one of the most convincing parts of the whole mystery. Some skulls show more than one surgery. Same person, multiple different times, cut, healed, cut again somewhere else, healed again. One skull found in France shows 5 separate operations, all on the same person, all healed to different degrees, which means they happened at different points in that person's life. Now stop and think about what that means for the surgeon, not just the patient. If you're going to operate on the same person 5 separate times, and they keep surviving, and they keep coming back to you, that's not luck. Luck doesn't repeat 5 times on the same skull. That's trust. That's a doctor with a reputation. Somebody in that community looked at this person's work and thought, this is who I go to when something's wrong with my head. That idea alone kind of rewires how you think about ancient people. This wasn't chaos. It was a working medical relationship. So how did they know where to cut? This is where it gets a little speculative. But the theory that makes the most sense to a lot of researchers is trial and observation over generations. Not one genius figuring it out alone. A slow build-up of knowledge, passed down, refined, corrected, passed down again. Think about it like this. Somebody at some point cut into a skull to treat a bad head injury. Maybe the patient survived. Maybe they didn't. But whoever was watching learned something either way. Which spot worked, which spot didn't. How deep was too deep. That knowledge didn't disappear when the surgeon died. It got taught. Probably by watching. Probably by doing it yourself under supervision, on someone else, with someone experienced standing right there guiding your hand. That's not so different from how surgeons still learn today, actually. Watch one. Do one. Teach one. It's an old saying in modern medical schools. Turns out it might be a lot older than medicine itself. There's also strong evidence that these surgeries weren't random emergency procedures. A lot of them were planned, deliberate, chosen. Here's why we think that. Some of the skulls with holes show no sign of injury at all, no fracture, no trauma, no evidence the person was hit in the head or hurt in an accident. Which means the surgery wasn't a reaction to some crisis. It was intentional, planned ahead of time for reasons we can only guess at. Maybe it was to treat headaches or seizures. Maybe it was to relieve pressure from swelling nobody understood the cause of. Maybe in some cases it wasn't medical at all. Maybe it was ritual, a way to release something people believed was trapped inside the head. Evil spirits, bad luck, pain itself, treated almost like an object that could be let out through a hole in the skull. We genuinely don't know which explanation fits which skull, and honestly, it was probably a mix of all of it, depending on the culture, the time period, the person doing the cutting. But here's what nobody really talks about enough. Whatever the reason behind it, the method stayed consistent. The technique itself, the actual physical act of cutting bones safely, that part was medical. That part required real anatomical understanding, whether or not the reason behind it was spiritual or practical. There's also evidence of aftercare, which might be the most human part of this whole story. Some skulls show signs that the wound was covered after the surgery. In parts of South America, archaeologists have found evidence that gourds, shells, and even metal plates were used to cover the hole afterward, almost like ancient bandages, protecting the healing bone underneath while it grew back. That's not a random act of desperation. That's aftercare. That's someone thinking ahead, planning for recovery, not just the operation itself. Let's also talk about pain, because I think about this a lot. There's no proof they had anesthesia the way we understand it. But there's strong reason to believe they used something. Plants with numbing properties, alcohol, extreme cold applied to the area, maybe even controlled blood loss to induce a kind of shock that dulled the pain. We can't know for certain what they used, but it's almost impossible to imagine skull surgery happening on a fully alert, unmedicated patient, one who could feel every scrape of stone against bone, and still lying still enough for the surgery to be done with the precision the bones show. Something helped that patient hold still. Something dulled what should have been unbearable. And maybe that's the detail that hits hardest. Somebody lay down, awake or partly awake, trusting another person enough to let them cut into the most vulnerable part of the body, trusting the tools, trusting the hands holding them, trusting that whatever came next, they'd wake up on the other side of it. This is honestly my favourite part of the whole mystery. Not the tools, not the technique, the trust. Because surgery, at its core, has always been an act of trust between two people. One person offering their body, another person offering their skill. That hasn't changed in thousands of years, and it won't change going forward either. The tools got better, the knowledge got deeper. But the basic exchange, the vulnerability of it, stayed exactly the same. And that brings us to something worth sitting with for a moment. None of this happened by accident. A steady hand with a stone blade, cutting the same precise pattern again and again on different people in different places across different generations. That takes practice. That takes teaching. That takes someone showing someone else exactly how it's done, probably over and over, probably for years, which means somewhere, long before doctors, before hospitals, before anything we'd recognize as medicine, there were already teachers, there were already students, there was already a tradition quietly passed from one set of hands to the next. Such steady skill could not appear from nothing. Somebody taught somebody else how to do this. So let's think about what that teaching actually looked like. We don't have a classroom, we don't have a textbook, no scrolls with diagrams, no manual passed hand to hand. What we have is something quieter, something you can only see if you compare skulls side by side, from the same region, from the same rough time period. And when researchers do that, they notice something strange. The cuts look similar, not identical but close. Same angle, same starting point, same basic shape of the hole. That kind of consistency doesn't happen if everybody's just guessing on their own. It happens when people are copying a method that came from somewhere, from someone. Think about how you'd actually learn this if you were alive back then. There's no school, no licensing board, no apprenticeship contract. What you'd have is an older person, maybe a healer, maybe someone the whole village already trusted, showing you how it's done. Probably first by letting you watch, then maybe by letting you hold the tool while they guide your hand, then eventually by stepping back and letting you try it yourself, with them standing close, ready to step in if something went wrong. That's not a wild guess. That's basically how surgical training still works today, just with better tools and cleaner rooms. Watch, assist, do it yourself under supervision. The structure of learning a dangerous, delicate skill hasn't changed much. What's changed is the technology wrapped around it. Here's something else worth sitting with. Skill like this doesn't survive by accident. If only one person in a village knew how to do it, and that person died without teaching anyone, the skill would vanish. Just gone. No skull is going to write down the method for you. So the fact that we find this same technique showing up again and again in different graves across different generations in the same region tells us the knowledge didn't die with the first person who had it. It got passed on, which means somebody at some point made a decision to teach it. Somebody sat down with a student, or maybe a son, a daughter, a chosen apprentice, and said, "This is how you do it. This is where you cut. This is where you don't." Now, there's a detail in the skulls themselves that backs this up in a pretty striking way. Some holes show what look like failed attempts, right next to the successful one. A shallow scrape, abandoned. Then, close beside it, the real cut, done properly. Researchers think this might be evidence of practice, maybe even training on a skull that was already dead. Practicing the technique before ever trying it on a living patient. If that's true, it changes the whole picture. It means these weren't reckless first attempts on desperate patients. It means somebody trained first. Somebody made mistakes where mistakes didn't cost a life, and only tried it on a living person once they knew the motion by feel. Think about what that means for a second. That's not just skill, that's a system. A way of making sure the next person didn't have to learn everything from scratch through trial and error on someone's actual head. That's an actual method of teaching, refined by people who understood that mistakes have consequences and who built in a way to avoid the worst of them. There's also a wider pattern that supports the idea of teaching lines, almost like family trees of knowledge. In parts of Peru, archaeologists have found groups of skulls, all showing the same surgical style clustered in specific regions. One valley might show one method, a different valley, a different technique entirely, done just as skillfully but shaped differently. That kind of regional pattern is a strong clue. It suggests local traditions, local schools of practice, if you want to call them that. Not one single global method invented once and spread everywhere. Instead, different communities working out their own approach, teaching it locally, refining it over time within that one group. That's actually a pretty human detail if you think about it. Different regions solving the same problem in their own way, each one building a tradition that made sense for their tools, their culture, their understanding of the body. It's not so different from how different regions today might have their own medical traditions, their own preferred techniques, shaped by history and local knowledge. Now here's a question worth sitting with. Was this knowledge held by one person in the community, or by a group? Some researchers lean toward the idea of a specialist. One person, maybe two, in a village who did this and only this. Somebody set apart from the rest of the group. Maybe respected, maybe a little feared. The kind of person people went to only when things got serious, when regular remedies weren't working anymore. Other researchers think it might have been more spread out. Maybe several people in a group had some knowledge of the technique, even if only one or two ever performed it. Knowledge kept a little wider, just in case something happened to the main healer. We don't know for sure which model fits better, but either way, the conclusion is the same. This wasn't random. This was organized. Somebody was responsible for keeping this knowledge alive and passing it forward. And here's what nobody really talks about. Teaching something like this requires more than just showing the technique. It requires trust between the teacher and the student. The teacher has to believe the student can be responsible with something this dangerous, and the student has to trust that what they're being taught actually works, even before they've tried it themselves on a real person. That's a heavy thing to hand over. Not just information, but responsibility. Think about the risk on both sides. If the student does it wrong, someone dies. If the teacher picks the wrong student, the knowledge might die with a mistake instead of surviving another generation. So whoever was choosing who to teach was likely choosing carefully, watching for steady hands, watching for patience, watching for someone who didn't panic. There's something worth noticing in all this. We tend to imagine ancient people as living day to day, focused purely on survival, with no room for anything as structured as formal teaching. But this pattern, cuts that repeat, methods that spread across generations, regional styles that stay consistent for centuries, tells a very different story. It tells us these communities had room for specialists, room for apprenticeship, room for the patient transfer of a dangerous skill from one person to the next, done carefully enough that it kept working for thousands of years across completely different cultures who never even met each other. That's the quiet, remarkable part of this whole mystery. It wasn't a fluke that happened once. It was a tradition, built by hands we'll never know the names of, taught to students whose names are lost too, using a rule of thumb passed down long before anyone thought to write anything down at all. And once you accept that teaching was happening, a new question opens up. Somebody had to be the first. Somebody had to try this before there was a tradition to learn from, so the harder question waits. Why did anyone start cutting open skulls in the first place? Let's talk about why anyone would do this in the first place. Because here's the strange part. Some of these skulls show old injuries, a crack from a fall, a dent from a club or a rock, damage that would have caused swelling inside the head, pressure building up with nowhere to go. And right there, near the injury, is the hole, cut close to the wound, sometimes right on top of it. That's not random placement. That tells us something. Think about what happens when someone gets hit hard in the head. The brain swells, blood pools, pressure builds up inside a space that can't stretch. Today, doctors know exactly what that means. It means the brain is being crushed from the inside slowly, and if nothing relieves that pressure, the person dies or ends up with permanent damage. Modern surgeons still do something similar. It's called a craniotomy. You drill into the skull, you relieve the pressure, you give the brain room to breathe again. It's one of the most basic emergency brain surgeries done today, and it saved millions of lives. So when researchers find an ancient skull with a fracture, and then find a surgical hole cut right next to that fracture, the pattern practically explains itself. Somebody got hurt, somebody swelled up, somebody got worse, maybe started acting strange, maybe couldn't speak right, maybe passed out and wouldn't wake up, and somebody else, someone with steady hands and a sharp blade, decided the only way to help was to open the skull and let the pressure out. That's not guesswork born from superstition. That's an actual medical response to an actual medical problem. It lines up almost perfectly with what we do today, just with far worse tools and far worse odds. Here's a case that shows this clearly. In parts of Peru, archaeologists found a skull with a deep fracture on one side. Right next to it, a clean surgical opening. The edges of that opening are smooth, rounded, healed, which means the surgery worked. The person didn't just survive the operation, they survived long enough for new bone to grow back around the hole. Years, probably, maybe longer. Now picture what led up to that moment. This person got hit, maybe in a fight, maybe fell from somewhere high, maybe got kicked by an animal. However it happened, the skull cracked and the person started showing signs of serious trouble. Maybe confusion, maybe a seizure, maybe one side of the body stopped working right, which is a classic sign of pressure building on the brain. Someone in that community had seen this before, had seen what happens when a head injury goes bad, when the swelling doesn't stop, when the person just gets worse instead of better. And that someone had also seen at some point what happens when you relieve that pressure. Maybe by accident the first time, maybe from watching a wound naturally break open and drain, and noticing the patient improve right after. That's actually one of the leading theories for how this whole practice may have started. Not through careful planning, but through observation. Ancient people noticed that some head injuries that broke the skin, even a little, seemed to end better than the ones that stayed sealed. Blood and fluid could escape. Pressure had somewhere to go. Maybe someone put that together. Maybe someone thought, if breaking the skin helps, what happens if we make an opening ourselves in a controlled way, instead of waiting for an accident to do it randomly? That's a huge leap of thinking. It means somebody looked at a bad situation, noticed a pattern in outcomes, and then acted on that pattern deliberately. That's not superstition. That's early science. Rough, dangerous, without any of the tools we'd want today, but built on the same basic idea that drives medicine now. Watch. Notice a pattern. Try something based on that pattern. See if it works. Not every case lines up with head trauma, though, and this is where things get more complicated. Plenty of skulls with surgical holes show no sign of any injury at all. No fracture, no crack, no old wound underneath the hole. Just a smooth, healthy patch of bone with a clean opening cut straight through it. So what was happening there? This is where the theories start to spread out in different directions. Some researchers think these cases involve headaches so severe, so relentless, that the community saw them as something dangerous, something needing serious action. We know from historical medical writing much later on from Greek and Roman doctors that head pain was sometimes treated by cutting or scraping at the skull, on the belief that something trapped inside needed a way out. Other researchers think seizures might explain some of these cases. Someone in the community starts having violent, uncontrollable episodes, shaking, losing consciousness, no obvious wound anywhere. In a lot of ancient cultures, seizures were seen as something almost otherworldly, a spirit entering the body, a curse settling in. And if that's what people believed, then cutting a hole in the skull wasn't crazy at all, from their point of view. It was a very direct, very physical way of giving something bad a way to leave. That idea sounds strange to us today, but it fits with how a lot of ancient medicine actually worked. Physical problems were treated with physical remedies, even when the belief system behind them was different from ours. The action still made a kind of sense on its own terms. Then there's a third possibility, and this one might be the hardest for us to picture. Some researchers think a handful of these surgeries weren't about injury or illness at all. They may have been religious, ceremonial, done on people who were mentally distressed, or who the community saw as touched by something beyond ordinary explanation. Not punishment, not experimentation. An attempt at healing, just aimed at something we'd now call a mental health condition instead of a physical one. We don't have a way to prove which explanation fits which skull. Bone doesn't preserve thoughts or beliefs, it only preserves the physical facts. A hole, healed or not healed, near an injury or not, that's the limit of what we get to work with. But here's what's worth sitting with for a moment. Whatever the reason, these communities were responding to real suffering. Someone was in pain. Someone was scared. Someone close to them decided that doing something was better than doing nothing, even when that something was this drastic, this dangerous, this final if it went wrong. That's a very human impulse. It's the same impulse that drives medicine today. Somebody hurts. Somebody else tries to help using whatever knowledge and tools are available at the time. Ancient people didn't have anesthesia, didn't have antibiotics, didn't have any real way to stop bleeding beyond pressure and time. And yet they still tried, still reached for a solution instead of just watching someone suffer or die. There's something worth noticing in how varied these cases are too. Some skulls, clearly injury-related, look like a direct physical fix, no different in spirit from a modern emergency surgery. Others, without any wound at all, point to something more complicated. Pain, fear, belief, a whole tangle of medical and spiritual reasoning we can only guess at now. And maybe that's the most honest thing to say about this whole mystery. We understand the injury cases. Those make clean, logical sense. But the cases without injury pull us into territory we can't fully map. We're left imagining a world where health, spirit, and belief were tangled together in ways that don't separate neatly into our modern boxes of medicine and religion. That tangle is worth sitting with for a moment before we move forward, because it means this practice wasn't one single thing, done for one single reason. It was a tool, used differently by different people in different situations, for reasons that shifted depending on what they believed was happening inside a person's head. And that opens up something even stranger to think about next. Some skulls tell a story of injury, the break, the swelling, the desperate fix. That part makes sense to modern minds. But the ones without any wound underneath, those pull us somewhere else entirely. Somewhere less about broken bone and more about broken spirit, and that's where this gets genuinely strange. Because if there's no injury, no fracture, no bruise on the bone, then the reason for cutting into someone's head has to come from somewhere other than the body. It has to come from belief, from what a community thought was happening inside a person who seemed sick in ways nobody could see or touch. Picture a village a few thousand years ago. Someone starts acting differently. Maybe they stop sleeping. Maybe they talk to people who aren't there. Maybe they fall to the ground shaking, then wake up with no memory of it. There's no wound, no blood, nothing a healer can point to and say, that's the problem right there. But something is clearly wrong, and in a world without any concept of brain chemistry, without any idea that thoughts come from electrical signals firing in tissue, how do you explain that? How do you explain a person who seems taken over by something invisible? A lot of ancient cultures landed on the same basic answer. Something got in. A spirit, a demon, a curse sent by an enemy or an angry god. The person wasn't sick in the way a person with a fever is sick. They were occupied. Something else was in there with them, and it needed a way out. This idea shows up everywhere, across cultures that never had contact with each other, in parts of ancient Europe, in ancient China, across the Americas, different languages, different gods, different rituals, but the same core belief. Bad things can enter a person, and sometimes the only way to remove them is to open a door. The skull becomes that door. Think about how this would have felt from the inside of that belief system. You're not attacking a sick person, you're rescuing them. You're giving whatever's trapped inside a physical way to leave the body. The hole isn't a wound, it's an exit. That reframes the entire practice. It's not medicine in our modern sense, but it's not madness either. It's a logical response built entirely on a different set of facts about how the world works. If you believe illness comes from something that gets inside a person, then cutting an opening is the most reasonable thing you could possibly do. This is honestly my favourite part of the whole mystery, because it forces you to imagine thinking in a completely different frame. Not wrong thinking, just different starting points, leading to actions that still feel, in a weird way, completely rational. Now here's something that makes this even more interesting. Some researchers have looked closely at where these non-injury holes tend to appear on the skull. And there's a pattern. A lot of them cluster near the same general area, close to where the brain handles things like mood, behaviour and impulse control. We obviously can't know if ancient healers had any real sense of that connection. They didn't have anatomy textbooks. They didn't dissect brains and map functions like scientists do now. But it's worth wondering, maybe generations of watching people, generations of trial and observation, led to some kind of rough, unspoken sense that certain problems, certain behaviour changes, seemed tied to certain parts of the head. Not science in the way we'd define it, but something like an early guess, built from pattern, even without any understanding of why the pattern existed. That's not so different from how a lot of ancient medicine actually developed everywhere else in the world. Think about the earliest healers using plants. Nobody understood chemistry. Nobody knew about compounds or enzymes. But people noticed that a certain leaf calmed a fever, that a certain root stopped bleeding. That was passed down, generation to generation, without anyone fully grasping the biology behind it. The result still worked, even without the explanation attached to it. Skull surgery may have followed the exact same road. Someone tried something, it seemed to help, it got remembered, it got repeated. Slowly, without any formal theory behind it, a kind of working knowledge built up. Not because people understood the brain, because they paid attention to outcomes. There's a broader idea worth sitting with here too. In a lot of old belief systems, health wasn't separated into body and mind the way we tend to split them today. A person was one whole thing. If a part of that whole thing broke down, whether you called it a spirit, an imbalance, or an illness, the fix could still involve the body directly. Cutting the skull wasn't seen as a purely physical act. separate from whatever was going on emotionally or spiritually. It was one single act meant to treat the whole person, all at once. That's actually strangely close to something modern medicine has only recently circled back around to. Doctors today talk more and more about how mental health and physical health aren't separate systems. Stress changes the body. Physical injury changes mood. Ancient people, without any biology to explain it, seem to sense that connection anyway. They just expressed it through spirits and rituals instead of hormones and neurons. Now here's something that complicates the picture even more. Some of these non-injury cases show multiple holes, not just one opening, but 2, 3, sometimes more, cut into the same skull, sometimes at different points in that person's life. You can actually tell, because each hole shows a different amount of healing, one fully smoothed over, one barely started, one raw, done right before death. That tells us something important. Whatever was happening to this person wasn't a single event. It was ongoing, a repeated struggle, maybe seizures that kept returning, maybe episodes of violent behavior that kept coming back, no matter what the community tried. And the fact that they kept operating, again and again on the same person, tells you they weren't giving up. They weren't treating this as hopeless. They were treating it as something worth continuing to fight, one surgery at a time, using the only tool they believed could actually reach the problem. That persistence is worth pausing on. Imagine being the healer in that story. Your first attempt doesn't fully fix things. The person still struggles, still has episodes, and instead of deciding the method was wrong, you try again. You still believe there's a path to helping this person, even after a setback. That's not blind faith. That's the same instinct behind every branch of medicine that's ever existed. You don't get it right the first time. You keep trying, because giving up isn't really an option when someone you know is suffering in front of you. There's also something to consider about how the rest of the community likely saw this person, especially if they were struggling with something like repeated seizures. In some ancient societies, we have hints that these individuals weren't feared or pushed away. Some may have actually been seen as touched by something powerful, not cursed exactly, chosen in a strange way, connected to forces other people couldn't reach. If that's true, then the surgery wasn't punishment. It wasn't an attempt to fix someone who was broken or wrong. It may have been an attempt to help someone the community saw as important, maybe even sacred, someone worth this kind of risk and effort. We'll never know the full truth behind any single skull like this. The bone can only tell us what happened to the body. It can't tell us what people said around the fire that night, or what they believed was moving beneath that person's skin. But maybe that unknown is exactly the point. These weren't people acting out of ignorance. They were people doing their absolute best with the tools, the beliefs, and the understanding available to them at the time, trying to explain suffering, trying to reach something invisible, trying, in whatever way made sense to them, to bring somebody back. And whether they were healing the body or the soul, they found something that worked often enough to keep doing it, generation after generation, across the ancient world. We've talked about the people doing the cutting, the healers, the surgeons, the hands holding the sharp stone. But what about the people on the other side of the blade? Let's turn the focus to the patients, the ones who actually went through these surgeries, because honestly, that's just as mysterious, maybe even more so. First, think about what it would take to agree to something like this. There's no way around it. It's terrifying. Even with trust in the community, with faith in the healer, you're lying down knowing that someone's about to cut into your skull. No anesthesia like we know it. No hospital. No guarantees. Just hope, and maybe a sense that this is your only shot. But it happened. And not just once or twice. We have hundreds, maybe thousands of skulls from ancient sites around the world, each one showing the marks of this surgery. Some of these skulls belong to men, some to women, some to children. The age range is huge. This wasn't reserved for warriors or chiefs or just the elderly. It touched all kinds of people. So why would anyone go through with it? The answer isn't simple. But if you break it down, you can start to see the logic, even if it's a different kind of logic from what we're used to. Imagine a young man, maybe 20 years old, living in a small village. One day he falls from a tree or gets hit in the head during a hunt. At first he's okay. Then, over the next few days, he gets headaches, maybe dizziness, maybe he starts acting strangely. His family gets worried. They've seen this before. They know that sometimes people never recover from head injuries. Sometimes they die. Sometimes they change in ways that can't be explained. But they also know that once in a while, someone survives after the healer makes a cut in the head. Maybe they've seen it themselves. Maybe they know a neighbour who got better after the same thing happened. That story gets around. It becomes part of the community's knowledge. So the family brings the young man to the healer. He might be scared. Who wouldn't be? But the pain, the fear of what's happening inside him, is worse than the fear of the cut. Or maybe he's too out of it to even know what's happening. The decision falls to his family, or to the healer, or to the elders in the group. Either way, he becomes the patient. Here's where it gets interesting. Some researchers have looked for evidence of how these people were treated before and after the surgery. They found signs that, in some communities patients were cared for, there are signs of healing, not just in the bone, but in the way the wounds were cleaned and shaped. The edges aren't rough, they're smooth, like someone took time to scrape away bits of bone, little by little, instead of just smashing through. That takes patience. That takes care. It's not what you'd expect if the patient was left alone or treated harshly. It points to people working slowly, maybe over hours, maybe even over days, to do this as safely as they could. And then there are the signs that people survived, sometimes for years. You can see bone growing back, closing part of the hole. In a few cases there are skulls with old and new holes, showing that the same person went through this more than once, and still kept living. That's not just luck. That's a system that worked well enough for people to trust it, at least sometimes. Now let's get even closer. What about the pain? Did they feel it? Probably, yes, but maybe not as much as you'd think. There's a theory that the skull itself doesn't have nerves for pain. The scalp does, but the bone doesn't. So once you get past the skin, there's a strange numbness. That doesn't make it pleasant, but it's not the endless agony you might imagine. There's also evidence that ancient people knew some ways to help with pain. Some skulls show signs of burn marks near the cut, which could mean they used heat to dull the area, either before or after making the cut. In some places, archaeologists found traces of herbs or resins around the wounds. We don't know exactly what those plants did, but it's possible some of them had numbing or calming effects. Maybe not as powerful as modern drugs, but still helpful. Think about the setting. This isn't a clean hospital room. It's a home, a hut, maybe even out in the open, surrounded by family or neighbours. There's probably a fire nearby. Someone might be holding the patient down, or singing or praying, or just talking to keep them calm. The healer works with stone tools, scraping, cutting, careful not to go too deep. Everyone is watching. Everyone is hoping. It sounds scary because it is. But there's something deeply human about it too. People coming together, risking everything, to give someone a chance. Nobody would do this if they didn't care. Let's look at a few real cases. In France, archaeologists found a skull from about 7,000 years ago. The person was a middle-aged man. He had a hole carefully cut into the top of his head, and the edges of the bone showed clear signs of healing. Not just a little. He lived for years after the surgery. That means he wasn't just a one-off case. He was someone who went back to daily life, maybe even to work, maybe even to family, with a piece of his skull missing. In South America, in what's now Peru, things get even more dramatic. There, archaeologists found hundreds of skulls with these cuts, dating from around 2,000 years ago. Some of these people survived not one, but 2, 3, even up to 7 surgeries. One person had 7 holes in their skull, each one showing a different stage of healing. That's a lifetime of risk and recovery. Why so many surgeries? Some think it was because of repeated head injuries, maybe from battle. Others think it was for chronic problems, seizures, headaches, or mental changes that kept coming back. Whatever the cause, the community kept trying. The patient kept agreeing, over and over. In other places like Russia and Eastern Europe, there are signs that children sometimes went through this. One skull from Russia, dated to about 5,000 years ago, belonged to a child only 4 years old. There was a small, careful cut in the skull and signs of healing. The child lived for months, maybe years, after the surgery. It's hard to imagine what led to that choice. Maybe the child was very sick. Maybe it was seen as the only hope. But the fact that someone even tried shows a level of care that's hard to ignore. Not every story ends well, of course. Some skulls show cuts that never healed. The person died during or right after the operation. Sometimes there are signs of infection or cuts that went too deep. Those are the tragedies, the risks that came with this kind of bold attempt. But the fact that so many did survive is still shocking. Let's pause and think about the experience from the patient's point of view. What happens in the days after the surgery? You're weak, maybe dizzy, maybe in pain, but you're alive. If the wound doesn't get infected, if the bleeding stops, if the healer's work holds, you start to get better. The people around you help. They bring food, they clean the wound. Maybe they hold ceremonies or prayers for your recovery. Some ancient graves include signs that patients were respected. They were buried with care, sometimes with valuable objects, sometimes with items related to healing or ritual. That tells us they weren't pushed aside or hidden away. They were honoured, maybe even seen as people who had crossed to the edge of life and come back. There's another layer here too. In some cultures, people who survived this kind of surgery gained a special status. Maybe they were seen as lucky. Maybe they were believed to have special powers or a connection to the spirit world. In a few cases, the healed holes in the skull were even enlarged after death, as if the community wanted to keep part of the person's spirit close. Now, it's easy for us to look back and wonder if these patients had any say in what happened to them. In some cases, probably not. If you're a child, or if you're unconscious, others make the decision for you. But in many cases, these were adults, and there's every reason to think they understood the risks. Maybe not in the way we do, with percentages and medical charts, but in a personal, lived way. They saw who survived, they saw who didn't, they made their own choice. There's also something to be said for hope. When you're suffering, when nothing else has worked, even a dangerous chance starts to look like a real option. That hasn't changed in thousands of years. People still make hard choices when they're desperate. The details are different. The feeling is the same. Let's talk about the scars. For those who lived, the mark was there forever. A dent, a ridge, a spot where the hair didn't grow back right. In some places, those scars were hidden. In others, they may have been shown off. Maybe they became a symbol, like a badge of survival. Some scientists have wondered if these survivors became something like living proof that the method worked. Their stories spread. People saw the evidence with their own eyes. That may have made others more willing to try, or at least less afraid. Is there a pattern to who got the surgery? Not always. There's no single age, no single gender, no set group. Sometimes more men, sometimes more women, sometimes both. Sometimes the old, sometimes the young. It varied by region, by time period, maybe even by what was happening in the community. War, famine, disease. All these things could change who became a patient. But what's clear is that these surgeries weren't secret. They weren't done in the shadows. They were part of the life of the group, something people knew about, something people talked about. And that means the patients weren't just victims. They were participants in a shared story. Here's another twist. In some sites, researchers have found skulls that show signs of healing from surgery, but also signs of other injuries. Old broken bones, healed wounds, signs of arthritis or other illness. These weren't people who lived easy lives. They were survivors in every sense. The fact that they made it through surgery and then kept living, often for years, says a lot about their toughness and about the support they got from those around them. What about the ones who didn't survive? Even there's evidence of care. Some of these people were buried with respect, sometimes with objects that suggest they were mourned, not blamed. In a few rare cases, the tools used in the surgery were buried with them, maybe as a sign of the community's effort, or of a ritual to help the spirit move on. Let's zoom out. Across space and time, what do all these patients have in common? It's not just the surgery, it's the willingness to try, the bravery to face something unknown, the trust in their community, their healer, or maybe in something bigger, a god, a spirit, a force that could save them. That's a kind of courage we can still recognize today. The details have changed, the feeling hasn't, and the impact goes beyond any one person. Every patient who survived became part of the proof that this method sometimes worked. Their lives, their scars, their stories, all of it became part of the reason people kept trying. One survival led to another. Hope spread, even if it was fragile. It's easy to look back and judge these choices from today's point of view. But if you put yourself in their place, you start to see the balance, risk and hope, fear and trust, the weight of suffering against the chance, however small, that things could get better. That's the story of the patients, not just as victims or as statistics, but as real people who face something most of us can barely imagine. They took a chance. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But every time it meant something to the people around them. This wasn't a desperate gamble. They had watched others live. They saw what was possible. And brain surgery was only one piece of a much bigger, stranger body of knowledge. Cutting skulls was one skill. It was not the only one they got right. If you picture early surgery, it's easy to imagine it as wild guesswork. But what actually shows up in the evidence is something much more careful and, honestly, much more advanced than almost anyone expects. It's not just about scraping away bone with a sharp rock. The more you look, the more you see layers of knowledge that go beyond just the cutting. These ancient people had something like a working pharmacy. Let's start with the tools. We already talked about sharp stones, flint, obsidian, even bits of animal bone or shell in certain places, but the story doesn't stop there. Some of the oldest medical kits ever found include more than just blades. In a few sites, archaeologists have uncovered little piles of plant matter, ground into powder or paste, right next to the tools. Sometimes there's charcoal mixed in, or traces of sticky pine resin. These weren't just leftovers. They seem to have been used on purpose, maybe for cleaning wounds, maybe for helping them heal. Now, if you hear pine resin or charcoal, it doesn't sound very scientific. But here's the thing, both of those are still used in medicine today. Pine resin is sticky and can seal wounds, keeping out dirt and germs. Charcoal is good at drawing out toxins. Even in modern hospitals, doctors sometimes use medical-grade charcoal to absorb poisons from the stomach. The same basic idea, just with more equipment. Next, there's the question of infection. Cutting into a skull, even carefully, is a huge risk. If bacteria get inside, things can go bad fast. That's true now, and it was true then. But when researchers test some of these ancient plant pastes, they find that many are natural antibiotics. For example, in the Alps, people used yarrow and mugwort. In South America, they used coca leaves and chili pepper. Both yarrow and mugwort have real proven effects against bacteria. Coca leaves numb pain, and chili pepper can help stop bleeding. It's not magic, it's chemistry, even if they didn't have the words for it. And it's not just plants. In some places, like Egypt and parts of the Middle East, honey was used on wounds. Why honey? Turns out it's one of the best natural ways to keep a cut from getting infected. Honey draws out water, which bacteria need to live. It also contains small amounts of hydrogen peroxide. Even today, you can buy medical honey in some pharmacies. Ancient healers were using it thousands of years before anyone named the bacteria it fights. Let's go deeper. What about the pain? Most people today would never let someone cut into their head without some kind of painkiller. And while there was no Novocaine, no morphine, ancient people weren't helpless. In Europe and Asia, they used poppy seeds. Poppies are the source of opium, which is one of the strongest painkillers known. In Africa and the Middle East, they used mandrake root and henbane, plants that can knock you out, or at least make you feel very strange. Sometimes they made drinks from these plants. Sometimes they burned them so the patient could breathe in the smoke. None of this is as safe or as precise as a modern drug, but it worked. At least it worked enough that people kept using it. In the Americas, different plants filled the same role. Willow bark is one. If you chew it, you get a small dose of something like aspirin. And there are records of healers using tobacco smoke, coca leaves, and even cactus juice to dull pain or make people calm. Every region had its own set of plants, but the pattern is the same. People were testing, sharing, and remembering what helped. Here's something you might not expect. Some groups even used things that acted like anesthesia. Not true anesthesia, like you'd get in a hospital, but something close. For example, henbane and mandrake can put people into a deep sleep. Doses were dangerous and sometimes people didn't wake up, but the fact that they even tried shows they noticed ways to make the patient less aware or less afraid. And even the act of burning herbs or making smoke does something. It can clean the air. Some plants, when burned, release chemicals that kill germs. Sage, for example, is one. It's not just about the smell or the ritual. It's about changing the environment in a way that helps healing. Let's pull back and look at a real example. In the mountains of Peru, a group of skulls was found with clear signs of surgery. Next to those skulls, archaeologists found little bundles of dried herbs and bits of animal fat. When those plants were tested, they turned out to be antibacterial. The animal fat mixed with crushed herbs made a kind of ointment. It stuck to the wound and kept it moist, so the bone could heal without drying out. That's not random. That's trial and error passed down until it became tradition. And in Europe, at a site in France, researchers found a pot with dried honey, bits of resin, and ground up moss. The moss was a kind called sphagnum, which soaks up liquid and also fights infection. It's still used today in some natural bandages. The whole mix was perfect for covering a wound after surgery. It kept it clean, it stopped bleeding, and it helped new tissue grow. Even the tools themselves show care. Obsidian blades were sometimes heated in fire before use. That's not just to make them sharper, it also kills germs. It's a simple kind of sterilization. In places where obsidian wasn't common, people used flint or even metal as soon as they learned how to make it. Metal tools could be boiled or heated more easily, so they were even cleaner. And there's more. Sometimes after surgery the wound was packed with cloth or soft plant fibres. These packed dressings soaked up blood and kept the wound from closing too soon. In some cases, these cloths were soaked in wine or vinegar before being used. Both wine and vinegar killed germs. The Greeks and Romans wrote about this, but people were probably doing it long before anyone wrote it down. So you have sharp tools, ways to clean them, natural painkillers, and even dressings to help the wound heal. That's everything you need for basic surgery. Not perfect, not foolproof, but a lot more advanced than most people imagine. Now you might ask, how did they know what to use? The answer is simple and complicated at the same time. It was all about watching, remembering, and teaching. If a plant helped a wound heal, people noticed. If something made pain go away, they remembered it. The ones who learned the best became the healers. They passed on their knowledge not with books, but with stories, songs, or just by showing others what to do. It wasn't exact science. There were mistakes. Some plants are poisonous if you use too much. Sometimes the dose was wrong or the mix was off. But over time, people learned by watching who got better and who didn't. That's the beginning of medicine, even if nobody called it that. And there's another piece. Healing wasn't just about the body. It was about the mind, too. In many places, surgery was part of a ritual. Healers sang, chanted, or burned incense. They tried to calm the patient to make them feel safe. This wasn't just for comfort. It actually helps the body heal. When people are calm, their bodies fight infection and pain better. Even today, doctors know that patients who feel safe recover faster. Sometimes the ritual itself involves special objects. In Siberia, for example, shamans used carved stones and painted bones during healing. In Africa, some groups tied charms to the patient's wrist or placed special leaves under the pillow. These things might sound magical, but they're also a way to focus care and attention. When everyone believes in the process, it becomes more powerful. And there's more to the story. In some places, the healers kept records in their own way. Not writing, but marks on bones or patterns carved into wood or stone. These weren't words, but they held meaning. Some researchers think these marks were reminders, like a code for which herbs to use or which songs to sing. Maybe even a way to remember which patient survived and which method worked best. Let's look at the numbers. In the Andes Mountains, over 800 skulls show signs of surgery. In France and Spain, almost 200 have been found. In North Africa, more than 100. And in every region, there are signs that people survived. The survival rate was sometimes as high as 60 or 70%. That's better than some hospitals in the 1800s, before modern medicine learned about germs. So how did they do it? They built a pharmacy out of what they had. Plants, minerals, animal parts, and time. Every healer was also a kind of chemist, even if they didn't know the word. They watched, they tested, and they taught. Some ideas spread across continents. Others stayed local, shaped by the plants and animals nearby. And these weren't secrets. People shared what worked. Travellers and traders carried plants and stories from village to village. A plant that helped in one region might be tried somewhere else. If it worked, it got added to the healer's collection. If it didn't, it was dropped. This was slow, but it meant that knowledge grew. Over generations, the pharmacy got bigger, the methods more refined. Here's a twist. Some of the plants used in ancient times are still used today. Willow bark, honey, sage, garlic, and poppy all show up in modern drugs. The main difference is that now scientists can test and measure exactly what's inside. Back then, all they had was experience and memory. But the results, in many cases, were the same, And there's one more thing. Sometimes the medicine wasn't a plant or a tool. It was warmth, rest, and care. After surgery, patients were kept warm. They were fed soft foods. People watched over them, cleaned their wounds, and kept them company. This support made a huge difference. Even today, doctors say that nursing care is half of what helps a patient recover. Ancient healers knew this, even if they couldn't explain it. Let's look at a day in the life of a healer. Sun comes up. Someone comes running. A child is sick, or an elder has a swollen head. The healer gathers plants, boils water, sharpens a blade. Maybe a helper starts a fire. The tools are cleaned in boiling water or heated over the flames. Someone grinds leaves or roots, mixes them with fat or honey, gets everything ready. The patient is brought in, surrounded by family. They're singing or chanting, maybe prayers. The healer works careful and slow. When the cutting is done, the wound is washed, packed with herbs, and covered with a dressing. The patient is wrapped in a blanket and given a drink, maybe with poppy, maybe with willow bark, maybe just warm water. For days, people check the wound, change the bandage, bring food and comfort. If the patient lives, everyone remembers. The healer adds another success to their reputation. If the patient dies, changes are made. Try a different plant, a new method, a new prayer. Over time, the methods get better, and the knowledge spreads across rivers, over mountains, through generations. Without books, without microscopes, without knowing what a germ is or what a molecule does, just people watching, caring, and remembering. So what does all this mean? It means that medicine isn't always about what you know. Sometimes it's about what you notice and what you share. The first pharmacies weren't buildings or shops. They were baskets of roots and leaves, jars of honey, fires for heating tools, and hands to hold the patient still. Every healer was part scientist, part caregiver, part storyteller. The skills worked. The proof is in the skulls that healed, in the scars that faded over time. People who knew nothing about bacteria or chemistry had assembled a working pharmacy. How? So we ask the obvious question. How could they possibly have known? Let's just stop and sit with that. Imagine a world before science, before books, before anyone wrote down, "This plant stops pain," or "This tool cuts best when it's sharp and clean." There were no test tubes, no labs, no microscopes. No one could see germs. There weren't even words for infection, or bacteria, or chemistry. Still, these early people were doing things that actually worked. They were solving problems that even modern doctors find tricky. So how did they figure any of it out? How do you start from nothing in a world where the only tools are stone and bone and end up with real medical knowledge? The answer is actually stranger and more interesting than you might think. It wasn't luck. It wasn't magic. It was something else. It was careful watching, slow learning, and a lot of trial and error. Let's break it down. First, picture a small group of people living close to nature. Every day they saw accidents. People fell, got cut, got burned, or hit their head. Sometimes they lived, sometimes they didn't. Over time, people started to notice patterns. Maybe they saw that packing a wound with certain leaves kept it from getting worse, or that using a sharp tool instead of a broken one left a cleaner cut that healed better. That's simple observation, but it's the start of science. But it goes deeper. Imagine a healer years ago sitting by a fire watching someone recover. Maybe she notices that when she gives her patient a drink made from poppy seeds, they seem calmer. They cry less, or even fall asleep. The next time she tries again, maybe with a different dose or at a different time. If it works, she remembers. If it doesn't, she makes a mental note. over years and then generations. These little experiments build up. The knowledge grows. You can see this in the way people use plants. In every region, there's a list of wild herbs, roots, and barks that became medicine. No one wrote these lists down at first, but they were remembered, passed from one healer to the next. Sometimes the knowledge was wrapped up in a story. Grandmother Moon gave us this root for fever. Sometimes it was simply, use this leaf when someone bleeds. The stories helped people remember. The stories changed, but the key fact stayed the same. And why did this work? Because people are good at watching what happens. They see if someone gets better or worse. If a plant makes you sick, you'll remember. If it helps a friend survive, you'll remember that too. It's not fast, it's not always safe. But over dozens of lifetimes, people start to know what helps and what hurts. Now, here's where it gets even more interesting. A lot of this knowledge can't be explained by guessing. Some plants look almost the same, but one can heal and another can kill. Some roots need to be boiled, others need to be eaten raw. How did people know which was which? The answer is, sometimes they didn't. There were mistakes, there were bad guesses, but the patterns that worked survived. The families and groups that remembered the right answers were the ones who lived longer, raised more children, and passed on those lessons. In a way, nature helped guide the experiment. Let's look at tools. Why use obsidian instead of flint? Why heat the blade before cutting? Why pack the wound with moss or honey? None of these things are obvious. But over time, people noticed that certain methods led to better results. Maybe one healer saw fewer infections after she started heating her blades. Maybe another learned that wounds covered with sticky resin looked cleaner and healed faster. The knowledge spread, person to person, group to group. Not through books, but through stories, songs, and hands-on teaching. But there's another thing. Sometimes people learned by copying. If a nearby group had better results, others would watch and try to do the same. In some places, we see the same patterns of cuts, the same mixes of plants, showing up in villages far apart. That's not an accident. That's sharing. That's people paying attention to what works and passing it along. But it wasn't just copying blindly. People tested things. They changed the mix, tried new plants, watched the results. Sometimes they made a lucky guess. Sometimes they paid a price for getting it wrong. But the process kept going. Each generation started with the lessons of the last but added their own tweaks. Over long stretches of time, this kind of slow testing added up to something like real medical knowledge. And here's a wild thought. It's not so different from how science works today. Modern research is faster and has better tools, but the basic steps are the same. Try something, watch what happens, remember the result, share what you learn. Let's get specific. Why did ancient people pack wounds with honey or use willow bark for pain? Because they tried it, saw it worked, and kept doing it. Why did they use poppy seeds? Same reason. They noticed that people who ate or drank poppy mixtures seemed to feel less pain. Why did they sharpen their blades or boil them before surgery? Because wounds treated this way healed better. There's another layer too. Sometimes new ideas spread by accident. Maybe a traveller brought a new plant, or a healer married into a different group. The best ideas didn't stay secret. They moved along trade routes, crossed rivers, jumped from one culture to another. Over time, the toolkit grew, the pharmacy got bigger. But the learning wasn't only about plants and tools, it was also about the body itself. Early healers learned what to touch and what not to touch. They figured out that cutting into certain parts of the head was safer than others. They saw that some patients bled less, or seemed to recover faster, if cuts were made in a certain pattern. Some even realised that scraping bone a little at a time was safer than trying to remove it all at once. These aren't obvious lessons, they were learned step by step. Now, you might wonder, how could they keep track of all this? With no writing, no books, how did anyone remember which plant helped fever, or which tool to use for cutting? The answer is, they used memory tricks. Songs, chants, simple patterns, stories, all helped people remember what worked. Sometimes knowledge was kept as a secret, only told to the next healer. Other times, it was shared with everyone. But always, there was some way to pass it on. Let's talk about mistakes, because not everything they tried worked. Some plants turned out to be poison. Some methods failed. People died from infection or from the surgery itself. But the failures taught lessons too. If a healer lost too many patients, people stopped trusting them. If a method led to more deaths, it was dropped. Over time, only the best ideas survived. Now, let's talk about another kind of knowledge, the kind that comes from listening, not just watching. Healers asked patients what they felt. Did the pain go away? Did the wound get worse? Did the fever break? Patients remembered what helped and passed that knowledge to others. It created a loop. Healers learned from patients, and patients learned from healers. The whole community was involved in the experiment, and there's something else. Sometimes people learned things they couldn't see directly. They noticed patterns. Maybe they saw that wounds healed faster in the summer, or that certain plants worked best when picked at a certain time of year. Maybe they noticed that people who rested got better faster than those who worked after surgery. These little lessons built up one observation at a time. So how do we know all this happened? What's the proof? It's in the bones. It's in the tools found next to them. It's in the plant traces, the burnt marks on blades, the bundles of herbs that survive for thousands of years under dry soil. Scientists today can test these things. They can look at the chemicals in old plant bundles or the marks left by sharp tools. They can see healing on skulls, bone growing back, wounds closing up, signs that someone survived. The evidence is there, plain as day. But there's a piece of the puzzle that's even harder to explain. Sometimes ancient people figured out things that still puzzle scientists today. For example, in some places early surgeons cut into the skull in just the right spot to ease pressure, but without hurting the brain. That's not easy. Even today, with scans and maps of the brain, doctors have to be careful. Yet ancient healers did it, and some patients lived for years after. How did they know where to cut? Some say it was luck. Others think it was years of watching, learning from past mistakes. Maybe there were a few people who just had a knack for it, and they became the teachers. Maybe the community kept close watch on which patients survived and which methods worked best. Here's another example. In some regions, people used mixtures of plants that, when combined, worked better than any single one alone. That's a kind of chemistry. Even though they didn't know the word, they learned to mix things. Herbs that stopped bleeding, roots that eased pain, honey that kept wounds clean. It wasn't just try everything and hope. It was closer to real testing, even if it looked different than what we call science. And here's a thought for you. What if these early healers were watching animals too? Some scientists think that's exactly what happened. Wild animals sometimes eat certain plants when they're sick, or lick wounds to clean them. Maybe people noticed. Maybe they got ideas from watching dogs, or bears, or even birds. Nature itself became the first teacher. But there's a limit to this knowledge. Not every method worked. Some beliefs were wrong. Sometimes people tried things that made no difference, or even made things worse. But the important part is they kept testing. They kept asking what helps and what hurts. The ones who noticed best, who remembered most, became the healers everyone trusted. This kind of slow, careful learning is the root of all medicine. It's the reason why, in a world before science, before books, before anyone could see germs or measure chemicals, people still managed to save lives. And there's something beautiful about that. It means that knowledge doesn't need to come from only labs or universities. It can come from everyday people, paying attention, sharing stories, and remembering what works. It's a reminder that our brains are wired for this kind of learning. Watch, test, remember, share. In the end, the answer to how did they know is simple, but not easy. They watched. They listened. They remembered. They shared what they learned. And they kept going, even when they didn't have all the answers. It means people were solving problems in a scientific way long before science existed as an idea. But the same method also led them badly astray. We should be honest. Not every ancient cure was a hidden success. For every smart discovery, there were treatments that made things worse, sometimes much worse. Some were just useless, others were dangerous, and a few were downright deadly. This is the side of ancient medicine most people don't love to talk about, but it's important. Because for every story of survival, there's another of harm. Sometimes the line between help and hurt was thin, almost impossible to see. Let's start with some of the wilder ideas. You've probably heard stories about leeches, bleeding, or strange potions. But the truth goes deeper. In many cultures, sickness was seen as a battle, not just against injury or infection, but against forces people didn't understand. Bad spirits, curses, the evil eye, or angry gods. If someone got sick, it wasn't just a problem for their body. It was a sign that something had gone wrong in the world, and that meant the cure might be just as harsh as the illness. One of the most common treatments was bloodletting. The idea was simple. If you were sick, maybe your blood was bad, so you cut the patient or used leeches and let some blood out. People did this for fevers, headaches, even broken bones. They did it for mental illness too. Sometimes the patient felt weak, dizzy, or even passed out. But that wasn't seen as a problem. In fact, it was taken as proof the sickness was leaving the body. The real problem, bloodletting, made many people sicker. If they were already weak from illness, losing blood only made them weaker. Some died from it. But this idea stuck around for a shockingly long time, well into the 1800s in Europe, and even later in some places. Another rough method was making people vomit or give themselves diarrhea. The thinking was, if the sickness is inside you, flush it out. So, healers used plants and roots that caused violent reactions. Some of these were toxic, like hellebore or certain mushrooms. People drank these brews and spent hours, even days, in agony, sweating, cramping, sometimes bleeding. The hope was that whatever was making them sick would leave with everything else. Sometimes people got better. More often, they just got weaker or died from dehydration. Let's look at a few real-life cases. In ancient Egypt, doctors had long lists of cures. Some were smart, like using honey on wounds. But others were strange or even dangerous. One cure for eye problems was to smear animal dung around the eye. They believed it would draw out the sickness. In reality, it probably caused infections. Some old Egyptian recipes mixed crushed bugs or mouldy bread into pastes for wounds. Without knowing about germs, they hoped these things would help. Sometimes they only made infections worse. Jump ahead to ancient Greece. You might imagine a world of reason and science, but even here, ideas could go off track. The Greek doctor Hippocrates, he's the do no harm guy, also believed in balancing 4 humours in the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you had too much of one, you got sick. So, cures were based on restoring balance. That meant more bleeding, more purging, and sometimes giving people things we now know are poison, like mercury or lead. These treatments didn't just fail, they sometimes killed people outright. In Asia, there were other risky ideas. In some early Chinese medicine, people swallowed ground-up stones, minerals and metals. They believed gold, jade or mercury could bring health, and even immortality. One famous example is the first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huang. He desperately wanted to live forever. His doctors gave him mercury pills and potions, believing the metal had magical powers. Instead, he slowly poisoned himself. He died at age 49, far short of immortality. Let's not forget Europe in the Middle Ages. When the Black Death hit in the 1300s, doctors and healers tried everything. Some believed bad smells caused the plague, so they burned herbs or wore masks stuffed with flowers. Others still clung to bloodletting or sweating out the sickness. There were even treatments that involved burning the patient with hot irons, hoping to drive out the illness. None of this worked. In fact, it probably spread germs, made people weaker, and did nothing to stop the plague. Here's something you might not expect. Sometimes being poor or powerless meant you got the worst treatments. In some ancient cultures, dangerous cures were tested first on people seen as less important. Prisoners, slaves, or even children. If the treatment didn't kill them, maybe it was safe enough for others. It's hard to hear, but it's true. Now, zoom back to the world of early brain surgery. Not every operation ended well. Some skulls show signs of infection, or cuts that went too deep. Sometimes the hole was made in the wrong place, causing brain damage or death. Other times the healer scraped away bone but didn't stop bleeding, or introduced dirt and germs into the wound. A few skulls show signs of healing, but also new infections or bone growing back in strange twisted shapes. That's the other side of the story. For every survivor, there were those who didn't make it. Let's talk about tools. The sharp stones and bone scrapers that worked for some things could be deadly for others. If the tool wasn't cleaned, or was used on more than one patient, germs spread fast, infections set in. There were no antibiotics, so a simple cut could turn deadly. Sometimes, the healer used the same blade for animals and people, making things even riskier, and there's evidence of tools with broken or jagged edges, which tore flesh instead of cutting cleanly. That made wounds harder to heal. Some plants used as medicine were actually toxic, even in small amounts. In South America, certain tribes used plant extracts to cleanse wounds or fight pain, but the same plants could cause hallucinations, seizures, or heart problems. One wrong dose, and the cure became a poison. In Europe, foxglove was used for heart problems, but too much could stop the heart completely. Even willow bark, which helped pain, could cause stomach bleeding if taken too often or in high doses. People didn't always know where the safe line was. Then there were treatments based on pure superstition. In parts of Africa, some healers believed evil spirits caused sickness. To chase away the spirit, they might cut the skin, burn it, or rub in ash or chili peppers. The pain was supposed to scare the spirit away, but it also left scars, infections, and sometimes permanent harm. In other cultures, people wore charms or swallowed stones thinking they'd protect against illness. At best, these did nothing. At worst, they choked or poisoned the patient. Some early medical ideas lasted for centuries, even after they were proven to be wrong. The humus theory stuck around for almost 2,000 years. People kept balancing blood and bile, bleeding and purging, long after it was clear these methods rarely helped. Why did these ideas survive? Because people wanted answers. When something seemed to work, even by accident, it became tradition, and traditions are hard to question, especially if everyone around you believes in them. Let's look at childbirth. In many ancient societies, giving birth was risky. Healers had little understanding of germs or hygiene. Midwives sometimes used dirty hands or tools, spreading infections. After birth, Mothers were often given potions to cleanse the body. Some of these drinks had herbs that caused heavy bleeding or even death. Others were full of alcohol or toxic plants, making recovery harder. Babies, too, were sometimes given honey or wine to calm them, something we now know is dangerous for infants. Mental illness was another place where things went wrong. People who acted differently were often feared or misunderstood. Some were forced to drink potions made from strange roots or animal parts. Others were locked away, beaten or burned. In extreme cases, healers drilled holes in the skull to let out evil spirits. If the person survived, it was called a success, even if their problems didn't go away. If they died, it was blamed on the strength of the spirit, not the treatment. Even pain relief could go wrong. Ancient doctors sometimes used alcohol or poppy juice to numb pain. At first, this helped, but over time, some people became addicted. In China and the Middle East, opium became a regular part of medicine. People used it for everything from headaches to broken bones. But nobody realized how easy it was to get hooked, or how hard it was to stop. Some people spent their lives chasing pain relief, never truly getting better. Here's a smaller example, but one that shows how things could go off track. In medieval Europe, people believed that wearing a piece of wolf skin could stop rabies after a dog bite. Others thought you could cure snake bites by placing a snake stone on the wound, a polished rock that was supposed to draw out the poison. None of this worked, and people died waiting for magic to save them. There were also times when medicine mixed with punishment. In some places, a sick person was blamed for their own illness. Maybe they'd broken a rule or angered the spirits. The cure could involve beating, whipping, or forcing them to confess. If they survived, it was seen as proof that the sickness had left. If not, it was chalked up to fate. False hope was another danger. Travelling healers, miracle workers, even early doctors sometimes sold fake cures. They offered bottles of coloured water or powders that did nothing. Desperate families spent all they had chasing a miracle. Some even believed in cures that were just stories, like drinking the water from a special spring or sleeping under a certain tree. Meanwhile, real problems went untreated. It's easy to judge these mistakes now, but remember, people were doing their best with what they had. They wanted to help. They wanted to save lives. Sometimes they succeeded and learned. Other times, they clung to old ideas because there was nothing else. The line between healing and harm was always moving. Let's talk about surgery again. Even after people learned how to cut bone, they didn't always know when to stop. Some skulls show multiple holes, or deep gouges that went right through the bone. In these cases, the patient almost never survived. Sometimes the cuts missed the safe spots and hit major blood vessels. Other times, the healer kept going even after the patient stopped moving. Pain and shock weren't understood the way we know them today. And while we've talked about plant medicines, not all of them were safe. Yew, for example, was used in Europe for skin problems. But the leaves and seeds are deadly. Even a small amount can stop the heart. In India, the root of the aconite plant was used for fever. It worked sometimes. Other times it caused vomiting, numbness, and death. Without careful testing, it was impossible to know which patients would live and which wouldn't. Sometimes, healing meant taking risks that made sense at the time. If a wound was infected, burning it with a hot stick or pouring boiling oil over it seemed like a bold cure. The idea was to kill the sickness with fire. But more often, it just killed healthy tissue and led to worse infections. In the chaos of war, these methods were used on soldiers, who often died from their wounds, not the injury itself, but the treatment. Let's not forget animal cures. In some places, people believed drinking animal blood could bring strength, or that eating certain organs would heal the same part of your own body. Eat a pig's heart for heart problems, or a wolf's brain for courage. These ideas sound strange now, but they were built on the logic people had. The results, though, were mixed at best and sometimes dangerous. So why did these harmful ideas last so long? Part of it is habit. If a treatment was used for generations, people trusted it. Another reason is hope. If you're facing death, you'll try almost anything. And sometimes, when people got better by chance, the treatment got all the credit, even if it had nothing to do with the cure. But the real lesson here is that ancient medicine was a gamble. Sometimes the odds were good, sometimes they were terrible. Every healer, every patient was rolling the dice with each new cure, and while the best ideas survived, the worst ones lingered far too long. Here's what stands out though. Even the mistakes taught lessons. If a cure killed too many, it was eventually dropped. If a healer failed, word spread. Slowly, over many lives and many losses, the truly dangerous ideas faded. Not because people suddenly got smarter, but because evidence, real results, couldn't be ignored forever. So, ancient medicine was always a mix. Real discovery mixed with dangerous guesswork. For early people, telling the difference was the great unsolved problem of human history, and honestly, in some ways, we're still learning how to do it. Let's step back for a moment. Forget the herbs and stone blades. Imagine all of these ancient people, all their struggles, every experiment, every mistake and victory, and ask, what does this actually tell us about who we are? Why does it matter that someone somewhere sat in the dirt with another person's life in their hands, trying to fix the unfixable with nothing but hope and a handful of tools? Start with something basic. People everywhere since the very beginning have tried to fight pain and sickness. It didn't matter if they lived in a cold cave or a sun-baked village. When someone got sick or hurt, people acted. They didn't just let it happen, they tried to help. That alone says something huge. It means caring for the sick isn't just a modern idea. It's old, it's deep, it might even be part of what makes us human. This willingness to try, even with little to go on, also tells us something about how people think. They didn't have science the way we do. Still, they noticed patterns. If a certain plant helped with headaches, they remembered. If a sharp tool cleaned out a wound and the person survived, that mattered. Over time, these lessons built up. They got passed down from parents to kids, from healer to apprentice. It's the very start of what we'd call knowledge. But there's more. These early healers weren't just copying each other. They were watching, testing, and sometimes even daring to change things. If someone died after a treatment, they might try something different next time. If someone survived, maybe they'd do it again. It was slow, and the stakes couldn't be higher, but it worked, at least sometimes. And when it did, those successes spread across valleys, over mountains, from tribe to tribe. This process, tiny steps forward, sometimes huge leaps back, shows an important truth. Progress isn't smooth, it's not a straight line, it's messy, full of wrong turns, accidents, and things that make no sense at all. But the drive to heal, to fix, to help, kept going anyway. That's a core part of our story. Let's look at the bigger picture. Why were people so willing to risk so much for a chance at healing? Part of it was hope, part of it was fear, but a huge part was connection. In every group, every family, losing someone hurt, sometimes more than a broken bone or a fever ever could. Trying to save a life, even with little chance, was better than doing nothing. It was a way to fight back against the darkness, against the things nobody understood. And here's something fascinating. These medical experiments weren't just about the body. They were about the mind and spirit too. When someone acted strange, or suffered fits, or seemed lost in sadness, healers tried to help. Sometimes with herbs or cutting, sometimes with rituals, chants, or prayer. The lines between mind and body, between sickness you could see and sickness you could only feel were blurry. But that didn't stop anyone from trying. This tells us early people saw health as something much bigger than just not being sick. It was about balance, about being whole. If your mind suffered, they believed your body would too. If you were haunted by dreams or cursed or angry spirits followed you, the healer's job was to fix more than just a sore arm or a fever. They tried to fix your whole world. Now here's where it gets really interesting. These ancient doctors, without even knowing it, were some of the first scientists. Not scientists with labs and white coats, but scientists all the same. They watched. They asked questions. Even if they didn't have words for it, they tested. They failed and tried again. They shared what worked. That's the start of science. That's the start of medicine as we know it. One thing stands out when you look at all these old bones, tools, and stories. People were incredibly brave. Not just the healers, but the patients. Imagine lying still while someone scrapes your skull with a stone, hoping it'll help. Or swallowing a bitter root because someone said it chased away sickness. There was so much trust, so much faith in something better, sometimes in the person beside you, sometimes in the world itself. But it wasn't blind faith. Over time, results mattered. If too many people died from a treatment, people noticed. If someone survived, that story spread. This is how knowledge slowly improved. Not by luck, but by paying close attention to what worked, even if nobody understood why. This also means the story of ancient medicine is really the story of trial and error. Try something, see what happens, remember the outcome, tell others. Generation after generation, the best ideas slowly rose to the top. The worst faded away, sometimes painfully slow, but they did fade. And this process, messy as it was, is the root of all science today. Let's talk about another layer. Community. Healing wasn't done alone. It was a social thing. Someone got sick or hurt and others gathered. Maybe they brought food. Maybe they helped with the work. Maybe they just sat nearby, hoping for a miracle. This shared effort mattered. It made people feel less alone. It gave hope where there wasn't much. Sometimes that was enough to tip the scales towards survival. You can see this in the burial sites too. People who survived brain surgery, even if they were left with scars or weakness, were often cared for. Skeletons show healed bones, not just in the head but all over the body, legs, arms, even spines. Someone had to feed them, clean their wounds, help them move. That means ancient people didn't just try to heal, they stuck around to help people recover. That's compassion in action. And think about this. The fact that brain surgery was done at all means people valued life. A lot. Otherwise, why go to such trouble? Why risk making things worse? They believed life was worth saving, even when the odds were bad. That belief still drives us today. Another thing these stories tell us is that knowledge doesn't belong to any one person, or even one group. It's shared, traded, borrowed, and changed as it moves. A healer might learn a new trick from a visitor. A plant used in one valley might show up hundreds of miles away, brought by travellers. Tools change hands, ideas change shape. This is how medicine and all knowledge grows. There's something else buried in these old stories. People weren't just copying by rote, they were creative. Sometimes out of desperation they tried things nobody had done before. Maybe it was an accident, maybe it was a flash of inspiration. But every now and then something new worked, and when it did, it could change everything. You can see this with the plants. Someone, somewhere, figured out that poppy sap dulled pain, or that willow bark made headaches fade. Maybe they noticed an animal eating a certain leaf, or maybe they just tried everything they could find. But the point is, they experimented. They learned by doing, not just by guessing. And when you look at the tools, you see the same thing. Early blades were rough, but over time people made them sharper, smoother, easier to hold. Obsidian, for example, can be flaked so thin it's sharper than steel. Some ancient knives could make cuts as clean as a modern scalpel. That didn't happen by accident. It happened by paying attention, by wanting to do better. Let's not forget the role of ritual and belief. Healers often used chants, charms, or prayers along with their practical work. Sometimes the ritual was more important than the medicine. It gave hope, it calmed fear, it made pain bearable. Even today, belief and hope still help people heal, sometimes in ways science can't fully explain. But here's what really stands out. Ancient healing teaches us that mistakes are part of progress. Every error, every failure, every loss taught someone something. When a treatment hurt more than it helped, people remembered. Maybe not right away, and maybe not perfectly, but over time, the worst ideas fell away. This long, slow battle between good ideas and bad ones is the real engine of history. It's not always pretty. Sometimes it's tragic, but it's relentless. There's another lesson here. Healing is never just about the body. It's about meaning, about trying to make sense of suffering. Early medicine was always tangled up with questions about life and death, fate and chance. People wanted reasons. They wanted to know why things happened and how to make them better. Sometimes the answers were wrong, but the need to ask the question, that's what matters. When you look at these old skulls, you're not just seeing surgery, you're seeing the roots of all care. The first spark of curiosity, the stubborn hope that things could improve if only someone tried hard enough, and that drive to fix, to question, to keep going even when things look hopeless, isn't gone. It's still with us. Every hospital, every pharmacy, every new medicine is built on the bones of these first, rough experiments. Let's talk about risk too. Early healers and their patients took wild chances, not because they wanted to, but because there was no other way. Every cure was a gamble. But the willingness to risk, to act when action might make things better, is part of the human story. Without it, nothing new would ever happen. And through all these risks, something else grew. Wisdom. Not the kind you find in books, but the kind hammered out by hard experience. The kind that says, we tried that. It didn't work. Let's try something else. That's how progress happens. Even if it's slow. If you zoom out, you see something beautiful. Every culture, every group found its own way to heal. Some used herbs, some used knives, some used prayer, or song, or touch. There's no single path, but the goal was always the same, to ease suffering, to save lives, to care for each other. This tells us there's no single right answer. Healing is a moving target. What works in one place or one time may fail in another. But the effort, the search, is what matters. When you see a scar on an ancient skull, a sign that someone survived brain surgery, it's proof of something bigger. It's proof that people didn't just accept suffering as fate. They fought back. Not always successfully, but always bravely. And when you look at all these stories together, you start to see a pattern. Humans are built to learn, to try, to share what works. We're stubborn, curious, hopeful creatures. We make mistakes. We suffer losses, but we keep moving forward. The story of ancient healing is really the story of how we became who we are now. It's about courage and failure and tiny flashes of genius in the dark. It's about the slow building of trust in others and in the world itself. It's easy to look back and laugh at the mistakes, but without those, there'd be no progress at all. Every wrong turn taught someone something. Every survivor helped push the world a little closer to what we have now. So the next time you see a bandage or a pill bottle, remember, it all started with someone squatting in the dirt, holding a stone, whispering a prayer and hoping for the best. That thread runs through every age, every culture, every life. And that's what these old surgeries and strange cures really tell us. They show us the roots of connection, curiosity, and hope. They prove that even in the darkest times, people kept trying, and that spirit, messy, brave, sometimes stubborn, is still alive in us now. We did not invent the impulse to heal. We inherited it, and that thread runs unbroken all the way to tonight. So let the whole story settle now. We've traced the long winding path from the hands that held sharp stones to the knowledge that moved across generations. Now, at the end, it's time to step back and see what all these details, skulls, tools, plants, scars and stories, add up to. Because the story isn't just about surgery. It's about what it means to be human, to face pain, to hope for healing, and to trust the people around you. Let's start by looking at the big picture. What does it really mean that people were performing brain surgery 7,000 years ago? Why does it matter that some patients survived and others didn't? The answer isn't just about science or even about luck. It's about the human drive to fix what's broken, to keep going even when the odds are long, and to take care of each other when things go wrong. First, let's think about risk. For early healers, every attempt was a step into the unknown. There were no books to check, no experts to call. Every decision was a gamble, based on memories, stories, and what someone tried last time. These people took chances, sometimes wild ones. They used the best tools they had, and they made their own rules as they went. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But the willingness to try is what matters most. If you look at the bones left behind, you see more than just scars. You see signs of survival. A skull with a healed hole tells you that not only did someone survive the cutting, but they lived long enough to heal. Sometimes there's even a second hole, a sign that someone went through surgery twice and survived both times. That's not just skill. It's evidence of community support, of care that went beyond the first bandage. Now zoom out even more. Across time and place, the details changed, but the pattern stayed the same. In South America, Africa, Europe, Asia, everywhere people lived, they tried to heal. Sometimes they used stone blades, sometimes metal, sometimes plants, or prayer, or strange mixtures of both. The tools changed, the beliefs changed, but the urge to heal never faded away. This unity is striking. Even when cultures were separated by mountains or oceans, they came up with similar answers. Scraping bone, cleaning wounds, using plants to dull pain. It's almost like there's a built-in drive hidden deep in our brains that pushes us to help each other survive. Maybe it's instinct, maybe it's culture, maybe it's both. And here's something else. When you follow the story of healing, you're really following the story of learning. Every time someone paid attention, remembered what helped, and told someone else, that was the start of knowledge. It didn't matter if the system was perfect. It mattered that people cared enough to remember and to teach. This is how ideas grow, not in a straight line, but in fits and starts, passed from hand to hand, changing shape with every retelling. Think about how much had to go right for any of this to work. First, someone had to notice that scraping a skull in just the right place sometimes helped. Then someone else had to be willing to try it again. Over generations, people improved the tools, found better ways to treat pain, and learned how to keep wounds clean. But none of that would have mattered without the courage to act and the patience to watch what happened next. All this points to a deeper truth. Progress doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen because someone is smarter than everyone else, or because one group has all the answers. It happens because people are stubborn. They keep trying, even when it hurts. They notice what works, and they pass it on. They learn from failure, even if it takes a long time. So what does ancient brain surgery really teach us? Not just that people were clever or desperate or lucky. It shows that hope is powerful, that even when all you have is a sharp stone and a prayer, you might still try to save someone's life. That matters. It's a sign of care, of connection, of a belief that things can get better, even if nobody knows how. This is why the story isn't just about bones and tools. It's about meaning. It's about the way humans face the unknown. Every attempt to heal, no matter how rough or strange, was a bet on the future, a promise that someone mattered enough to fight for. Even when the outcome was uncertain, the act of trying was itself an act of love. Let's look at the idea of trust. In the oldest surgeries, trust was everything. Patients had to trust the healer. The healer had to trust their own hands and the stories they had heard. The community had to trust that helping the sick was worth the risk. Without trust, none of this could have happened. This trust didn't come cheap. It was built slowly through experience. If a healer saved someone, word spread. If a treatment failed, people remembered too. Over time, the best ideas survived. The rest faded away. This is how real progress works, not just in medicine, but in every part of life. And here's another piece of the puzzle. Healing wasn't just technical, it was emotional, it was social. When someone was sick or hurt, their pain was shared by everyone around them. The effort to heal was a group project. People gathered, watched, hoped, and sometimes mourned together. The act of trying to save a life brought people closer, built bonds, and shaped the way groups survived. Now, take a moment to think about the limits. Early healers didn't know what we know now. They couldn't see germs or understand the brain's pathways. They worked with what they could see and touch. But that didn't stop them. They worked anyway. Sometimes mistakes were made. Sometimes pain was made worse. But the effort continued, generation after generation. This teaches us something important about failure. In ancient healing, failure was part of the process. If a treatment didn't work, it was a lesson. If someone died, it was a tragedy, but also a chance to rethink. This slow, sometimes painful learning is what built the base for everything that came next. You can see the same process everywhere. In every field, not just medicine, progress is built on mistakes. We move forward by learning what doesn't work, as much as by discovering what does. It's never easy, and it's never perfect, but it's the only way to grow. Let's talk about the tools for a second. The sharp stones, the bits of bone, the ground-up plants. Each one tells its own story, not just of technology, but of imagination. Someone had to see a piece of obsidian and imagine it as a knife. Someone else had to watch an animal chew a plant and wonder if it could help with pain. These moments of curiosity are the sparks that light the way forward. And here's what's wild. Sometimes, ancient healers made discoveries that still work today. Willow bark for pain, poppy sap for sleep, obsidian blades for cutting. Some of these ideas lasted thousands of years, passed down through families, picked up by new cultures, carried across continents. The thread runs long and strong. But it wasn't just about what worked. Sometimes things that seemed right were actually wrong. Bloodletting, weird potions, dangerous herbs. People tried them, learned from the results, and slowly changed course. It's a reminder that progress is never safe from mistakes. Even today, we're always learning, always correcting. So what do we take away from all this? Maybe it's this. The urge to heal is one of the oldest, most stubborn parts of being human. People have always fought to save each other, to ease pain, to push back against the limits of what they understood. That hasn't changed. The tools are better now. The knowledge is deeper, but the core impulse is still the same. Let's step into the shoes of those ancient healers for a moment. Imagine crouching in a smoky hut, hands shaking, unsure if what you're about to do will help or hurt. Imagine feeling the weight of someone's trust, knowing the whole group is watching, hoping for a miracle. That stress, that hope, that courage, it's all still with us today. Every time a doctor walks into a surgery or a nurse holds someone's hand, that old story continues. And what about the patients? It's easy to forget their bravery, lying still, holding on to hope, trusting that someone else's hands might give you another chance. That faith is hard to measure, but it is as important as any tool or skill. Now let's talk about meaning in suffering. Early medicine wasn't just about fixing bodies. It was about making sense of pain, of death, of questions nobody could answer. Rituals, prayers, chants. These were ways to bring order to chaos, to make pain feel less lonely. People searched for reasons, even when there weren't any clear ones. That search for meaning is still with us. All of this, tools, risks, trust, failure, meaning, comes together in the old stories of brain surgery. When you look at a skull with a healed hole, you're seeing the end of a long chain of hope and effort. You're seeing the proof that someone cared enough to try, even when nobody knew what would happen. That's powerful. And here's something gentle to hold on to. Every time we help someone else, every time we try to ease another's pain, we're reaching back through time. We're part of a long, quiet tradition. The hands have changed, the tools have changed, but the feeling is the same. It's easy to feel small when you think about the past. So many years, so many mysteries. But these stories remind us that we're connected. We carry the same hopes and fears. We look for answers in the dark. We reach out, again and again, trying to make things better. So when you see old bones in a museum or read about ancient surgeries, remember this. You're looking at echoes of your own story. The story of humans who refused to give up, who kept searching for ways to heal, who believed that every life was worth saving. And that's where we are now. Medicine has changed. The world has changed. But the heart of the story hasn't. We're still learning, still risking, still trying to help each other survive and thrive. In the end, maybe that's what matters most. Not the perfect cure, not the sharpest tool, not even the longest survival, but the act of trying, the refusal to give up, the hope that tomorrow might be better if only we keep going. So let this story settle in. Take comfort in the long chain of hands reaching out to help, from the ancient past to today. Let it remind you that you're not alone, that you're part of a much bigger story. And as you drift off, remember the urge to heal, to hope, to care. It's ancient, but it's never gone away. Rest now, ease into sleep. Good night.